I want you to picture something for a second. You're standing on a subway platform. It's loud, it's hot, you can smell that specific mix of ozone and stale air. You look down at the tracks, you see the two rails the train runs on, but then there's that third one.
The high voltage conductor.
Right. The third rail is this paradox, right? It is literally the source of power. Without it, the train is just a heavy metal box sitting in the dark. But every single person on that platform knows one fundamental rule. You do not touch it. You don't even, point at it too aggressively.
Because the shock is lethal.
Exactly. And looking through the research we have for today, actually looking at the cover art for this deep dive, I see those three converging rails with that center one glowing, this radioactive red-orange, and there's lightning arcing off it. And I realized we're about to grab that rail with both hands.
We are talking about the police.
Yeah. I mean, even just saying the word into the microphone, I feel a little tension. And I think, the listener probably does too. Because usually when this topic comes up, it's because something went wrong.
It's always in response to a crisis. A viral video, a shooting, a riot, a political debate that turns into a screaming match.
It's so polarized.
Completely. You're either backing the blue or you're defunding. There is very little oxygen in the middle.
But that is exactly why we wanted to do this specific deep dive.
Yeah.
We aren't here to talk about this week's headlines. We aren't here to, litigate a specific shooting. We have this stack of research in front of us titled Evolution of American Policing, From Partnership to Detachment. And the mission today is different. We want to act like mechanics. We want to pop the hood and look at the engine.
And what's fascinating about this engine is that it wasn't always built this way. The anxiety we feel today, the tension between a community and a patrol car, that isn't a law of physics. It was engineered.
That's the hook that got me.
Yeah.
That specific point. We tend to think of the police as this static institution. Like they've always been guys in uniforms in cars responding to 911 calls. But this research argues that the current system is actually the result of a massive fix that happened in the 1930s.
It's a classic case of the law of unintended consequences, a really, really big one. The system we have now, the one that feels so detached and sometimes, cold, was actually designed to solve the problems of the previous system, which was too close, too messy, and frankly, too human.
I saw that number on the visual for this episode, 74%. It's sort of fading in the background. And in the context of this research, it feels like a confidence interval that isn't quite earned. Like, we think we understand 74% of why this system works the way it does. But once you dig into the history, you realize we're operating on myths.
That's a great way to put it. We are operating on a mythology of policing rather than the history of it.
So to understand why the officer stays in the car today, we have to understand why he used to sleep on the floor of the station house in 1850.
Exactly. We're going to trace the pendulum swing from the political era of the 1800s to the reform era of the 1900s, and then right into the crisis we're in now.
It's a journey from the sidewalk to the windshield.
And back again, hopefully, or at least the attempt to get back.
Hopefully. Okay, let's grab the third rail. Let's do this. So, set the scene for us. We're going back to the origin story, segment 1, the political era. We're talking 1840s.
Right. And you have to forget everything you think you know about modern policing. If you were walking down the street in New York or Boston in, say, 1830, there are no cops.
What do you mean? Who catches the bad guys?
Well, mostly nobody. Or it was a night watch system. It was basically all the men in the town were expected to volunteer to take turns walking around at night with a rattle or a lantern.
A rattle, like a baby rattle.
No, a loud wooden ratchet, a noisemaker. If you saw a fire or a riot, you spun the rattle, made a huge racket, and hoped your neighbors woke up to help you. It was essentially a volunteer civic duty.
Okay, that sounds charming in a, colonial Williamsburg kind of way, but...
It was terrible. I mean, it was completely ineffective. Most people who had money just paid someone else to take their shift. Usually someone who was, drunk or elderly or just desperate for a few cents. So you had these watchmen who were mostly sleeping on the job.
So not exactly the thin blue line.
Not even close. And meanwhile, the cities are exploding. This is the Industrial Revolution.
Right.
Massive. New York, Boston, Philadelphia. They are doubling and tripling in size. You have huge waves of Irish and German immigrants pouring in. You have poverty, like we can't even imagine. Dense tenements, disease. The night watch couldn't handle it. The social fabric was tearing apart.
So the rich people in these cities, the merchants, the landowners, they look around and say, we need a professional force.
Exactly. Boston starts the first department in 1838. New York follows in 1845. But, and this is the crucial part that explains the next 80 years, they didn't model it after the military. They modeled it after the political machine.
Okay, I want to double click on this because the research calls this the political era. And I think when we hear politics today, we think of like arguing on Twitter. But politics in 1850s New York was a different beast entirely.
Oh, it was a feudal system. It really was. You had the ward boss. He was the local politician who ran the neighborhood. And when I say ran, I mean he controlled everything, the jobs, the contracts, the housing, and he controlled the police.
So if I wanted to be a cop in 1850,
hmm
I didn't go to the police academy.
There was no academy, there was no test, there was no physical. You went to the ward boss and said, I need a job. And if you had voted for him, or if your family had, or maybe if you had roughed up some people who were going to vote against him, he'd say, okay, here's a copper badge, you're a cop.
Wow. So the loyalty wasn't to the Constitution or even to the city. It was to the boss.
100%. And that created this really weird dynamic. This is what the research calls the partnership model. On one hand, these cops were incredibly integrated into the community. They had to be.
They walked the beat.
They walked the beat. They lived in the neighborhood. They knew everyone by name. They knew who was having an affair, who was in debt, whose kids were sick. They were deeply, deeply embedded.
I saw this note about soup kitchens. The police ran soup kitchens. That just seems so foreign to me.
They did. In the late 19th century, police stations were often the primary social safety net. If you were homeless, you slept on the floor of the precinct. They were called station house lodgers. If you were hungry, the police fed you. If you needed a job, the cop might know a guy down at the docks and help you find one. They were, in a way, all-purpose social workers.
That sounds surprisingly progressive. That sounds like what activists are asking for today. Community support, not just enforcement.
It does, doesn't it? But here's the asterisk. The giant flashing neon asterisk. It wasn't charity. It was patronage.
Meaning what exactly? Buying votes.
Precisely. It was a transaction. The police helped their people. If you were an Irish cop in an Irish ward, you took care of the Irish immigrants so they would keep voting for the Irish ward boss who gave you your job. It was a self-perpetuating system of power.
So it's not really about the public good. It's about maintaining the machine's power.
Absolutely. So if a group of Italian immigrants moved in down the street, or if a black family tried to move in, you didn't give them soup. You gave them the baton.
So the police were essentially the enforcers of the local tribe.
Right. The research uses the phrase, maintain the social hierarchy. If the factory owner was paying the ward boss, the police were used to break the strikes. Brutally. There was no internal affairs. There was no civilian oversight. Corruption wasn't a bug in the system. It was the operating system.
The feature, not the bug.
It was the entire point. You paid for your promotion. You paid to get the beat with the best gambling den so you could collect bribes. It was a protection racket with a badge.
But it was intimate. That's the key. That's the part that gets lost. Good or bad, the cop was a person you knew. He was a face, not a uniform. You probably drank with him. You might have grown up with him. He was a piece of the neighborhood furniture.
For better or for worse. And mostly for worse if you weren't in the dominant group.
Now, we have to look at the other track. Because while this is happening in the industrial north, something very different and very dark is happening in the south. The source material is really clear about this parallel evolution.
The southern track is vital here. We absolutely can't talk about American policing without talking about the slave patrols.
And the timeline here surprised me. These actually predate the northern police departments by a lot, right?
They do, by more than a century in some cases. In the 1700s, you had paddy rollers or slave patrols. These were organized, state-sanctioned groups of white men. Their sole function was to enforce the system of slavery, to catch runaways, to terrorize enslaved people, to prevent rebellions, to enforce the slave deeds.
And the research makes the point that this wasn't just law enforcement, it was race enforcement. It was about controlling a population.
Explicitly, the law was designed to maintain slavery, and they were the enforcers of that law. There was no other purpose. And when the Civil War ended in 1865, those patrols didn't just vanish. The personnel and the tactics just transitioned.
How so?
Well, they became the primary enforcers of the Black Codes, and then later, Jim Crow laws. The goal remained the same. Social and racial control. So the very foundation of policing in the South was built on a model of oppressing a specific part of the population.
So in the North, the police were enforcing the will of the political machine. In the South, they were enforcing the racial hierarchy.
And in both cases, you can see how the law was secondary to the order. An order meant keeping certain people in their place. This is why when we talk about rebuilding trust today, a lot of historians stop and ask, Rebuilding what? For many communities, that foundation of trust never existed. The starting line wasn't zero, it was negative, deeply negative.
That is a heavy context to hold. So you
Hmm.
get to the turn of the century, 1900, 1910, you have these two systems. Both are deeply human, but deeply corrupt and deeply biased. And the country is getting bigger, the corruption is getting more and more blatant and out of control.
It was unsustainable. You had cops who were drunk on duty, cops who were essentially criminals themselves. The cities were becoming more complex, and this hyper-local patronage-based system just couldn't cope. And the rising middle class, the progressives, started to look at this and say, we have to fix this. This is not how a modern country should run. We need to take the politics out of policing.
And that impulse, that desire to clean it up, is what pushes the pendulum. It's the beginning of the big swing.
It pushes us into the reform era. And this is where the story shifts from who you know to what you know, and where technology enters the picture and changes everything.
This is segment 2, the pivot to professionalism, or as the outline calls it, the reform era.
Right. And to understand this, you have to understand the mood of America in the early 20th century. It was the age of the machine, the age of efficiency, the assembly line.
Taylorism.
Exactly. Frederick Winslow Taylor. The idea was that you could scientifically manage anything, a factory floor, a government agency, a kitchen. If you measured it, timed it, and standardized it, you could make it perfect and efficient.
And they wanted to apply that to the police. They wanted to turn this messy, corrupt, soup kitchen running gang into a sleek, professional machine.
That was the dream. Take the human element, the messy, corruptible part out of it as much as possible, and they had a champion, a guy named August Vollmer.
The outline calls him the father of modern policing. But who was he? Was he just another ward boss with a new idea?
No, he was the absolute opposite. He was the chief of police in Berkeley, California, starting in 1905. And he was a nerd in the best possible way. He was an intellectual. He was a true believer in science and progress.
A cop who reads, that feels unusual for the time.
A cop who reads sociology, criminology, psychology. Vollmer looked at his officers and said, this isn't a job for thugs. This is a profession. It's like being a doctor or a lawyer. He actually advocated for officers to have college degrees.
In 1905, that seems wild. Most people didn't even have high school diplomas, let alone college degrees.
It was radical. He was laughed at by a lot of the old school chiefs, but he pushed ahead. He introduced the idea of a police academy. He said, you can't just pin a badge on someone. You have to train them in the law, in ethics, in investigation.
So merit-based hiring.
Merit-based hiring, standardized training. He brought in IQ testing. He established the first crime lab in the U.S. He was the first to use the lie detector in investigations. He was obsessed with using science to solve crime.
He wanted to replace the hunch with data.
Exactly. And his most famous student, a guy named O.W. Wilson, took these ideas and really scaled them up. Wilson is the one who really pushed the bureaucratic model. He wanted a strict chain of command, like the military. He wanted everything standardized, written down in manuals.
So no more taking bribes from the gambling den because you have a supervisor watching you.
And no more playing favorites with the neighbors because you have a rule book to follow. The goal was to make the police impartial, to sever those local ties that bred corruption. They saw those intimate community connections not as a strength, but as a source of contamination.
And to do that, to create that distance, they used two pieces of technology that changed everything: the car and the radio.
It's hard to overstate how much the automobile changed policing. Before the car, the beat was defined by how far a man could walk in his shift. It was small. It was intimate by necessity.
And the communication was terrible. I was reading about the old call box system.
Right. Before radios, if you were a cop on the beat, your sergeant had no idea where you were. You had to walk to a specific street corner at a specific time, open a box, and use a telephone to check in every hour.
I'm here, Sarge. Everything is quiet. And that's it.
And if a robbery happened 5 minutes after you checked in, the sergeant couldn't reach you until you called in again an hour later. It was slow, it was inefficient, it drove the reformers crazy.
So enter the radio car, a ruling communications hub.
Suddenly you have a patrol car. And at first the radios were one way. The dispatcher could talk to you, but you couldn't talk back. But by the 1940s, you have two-way radios. Now you have a command and control center.
The dispatcher becomes the brain, and the cars are the limbs. The city becomes a grid.
And O.W. Wilson had this theory he called omnipresence. He believed that if you had enough cars, and they drove fast enough, and they patrolled randomly enough, the police would seem like they were everywhere at once.
Like the panopticon, the all-seeing eye.
Exactly. The idea was that the sheer visibility of the machine of the patrol car would deter crime. And if a citizen called for help, the car could be there in 3 minutes. Rapid response was the new metric for success.
It sounds perfect. It sounds like the future. You've got clean-cut professional officers. They aren't taking bribes. They are responding fast. They are using science and forensics. This must have seemed like a golden age.
It was the golden age of the reform movement. The police were finally professional. They were crime fighters. They weren't social workers running soup kitchens anymore. They were law enforcement officers. They had a specific, narrow, scientific job to do.
But, and here's the massive but, that brings us to segment 3. In gaining all this efficiency, all this professionalism, they lost something essential.
They lost the street. They lost the human connection.
Segment 3, the unintended consequence. Let's talk about the windshield barrier. I love that term.
It's a concept that urban sociologists talk about, and it's perfect here. Think about the sensory experience of walking a neighborhood versus driving through it.
Okay. If I'm walking, I hear conversations. I smell what people are cooking for dinner. I can make eye contact. If someone looks confused or lost, I can stop and ask if they're okay. The pace is human.
Right. You are in the environment. You are permeable. Now, put yourself in a 1950s patrol car. You are moving at 30 miles an hour. The windows are rolled up because you have the AC on, or maybe it's just loud. You're listening to the static of the radio.
The environment becomes scenery. It's something you watch, not something you're a part of.
It becomes a blur. You don't smell the bakery. You don't hear the kids playing. The only thing you hear is the dispatcher telling you where the trouble is. Your entire perception of the neighborhood is filtered through a lens of crisis.
This is a profound psychological shift. The officer stops being a participant in the neighborhood and starts being an observer. Or worse, a hunter looking for prey.
Exactly. And because the officer is in the car, the casual interaction dies. In the political era, you might say hello to the cop just because he was standing there on the corner every day. You'd build a rapport over time through dozens of tiny, meaningless interactions.
You can't say hello to a car driving past at 35 miles per hour.
No. And so the only time you interact with a police officer is when something has gone wrong. Either you've called them or they're stopping you.
And that changes the nature of the relationship entirely. It becomes transactional and adversarial by default. If I only see you when you are arresting my neighbor, or when you are giving me a ticket, or when my house has been robbed, I don't see you as a partner. I see you as a service provider at best, or an authority figure to be feared at worst. And the research mentions another unintended consequence of technology that really amplified this, the 911 system.
Oh, this is huge. We think of 911 as a basic utility, like water or electricity. But when it was introduced and popularized in the late 60s and 70s, it flooded police departments with work they were never designed to handle.
Because suddenly, it was incredibly easy to call the cops. The barrier to entry was gone.
Before, you had to look up the number for the local precinct. You had to make a conscious effort. With 911, it's a reflex, so people started calling for everything. My neighbor's dog is barking. There are kids playing ball in the street. My boyfriend is yelling at me. All of these minor social frictions that used to be handled by families or neighbors were now dumped onto the police.
So the police became secretaries. Or, well, call center responders.
They became reactive response units. The radio was constantly barking orders. Car 54, go to 3rd Street for a noise complaint. Car 54, go to 5th Street for a domestic. The officers were running from call to call to call. They didn't have time to get out of the car and walk around, even if they wanted to.
They were slaves to the radio. The efficiency model trapped them.
Correct. And this created what sociologists call stranger policing. You have officers who don't live in the neighborhood, who might not even be from the same city, who don't know the people, driving into the neighborhood to handle a crisis and then leaving immediately to go to the next crisis.
That sounds incredibly alienating.
Yeah.
For everyone involved.
It is deeply alienating. To the community, the police look like an occupying force. They swoop in, exert control, and leave. They have no investment in the neighborhood. To the police, the community looks like a war zone. They only see the problems. They don't see the church picnics or the kids doing homework. They only see the crime, the dysfunction, the crisis calls.
So you have this mutual withdrawal. The police retreat into the patrol car and their own subculture, and the community retreats into their homes and stops trusting them.
And the trust just evaporates. The partner has left the building. The professional has arrived, but he's a stranger. And he's a stranger who only shows up when things are bad.
And this brings us to the breaking point. because you can only sustain that kind of stranger policing for so long before reality crashes into it, before that high-voltage third rail starts to arc.
Segment 4, the collision course.
We are in the 1960s now. The country is going through massive social upheaval. The civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, the counterculture, everything is in flux.
And the police, this new, rigid, bureaucratic, professional model, hits the chaotic reality of a changing America, and it shatters.
The source material points to the 1950s and 60s as the era where the mistrust calcified. I like that word. It hardened into something permanent. Why then?
Because the police were the pointy end of the spear for the status quo. When the civil rights movement marched for equality, who met them on the Edmund Pettus Bridge with batons and dogs?
The police.
When students at Berkeley or Columbia protested the Vietnam War, who cleared the campus? The police. The professional model claimed to be apolitical, but in reality, it was enforcing a very specific social order, an order that was being challenged from all sides.
And in the cities, in the black and brown communities, this tension just exploded. We're talking about the urban riots. Watts in 65, Newark and Detroit in 67. Dozens of cities.
And we have to look at what sparked those riots. In almost every single case, it wasn't a protest planned weeks in advance. It was a standard police interaction, a traffic stop, a raid on an after-hours club, some small moment of friction.
A spark in a room that was already filled with gas.
Exactly. The years of windshield policing, of being treated like subjects by an occupying force, of feeling like the police were there to control you, not protect you, it all boiled over.
There was a government report about this that the research highlights as being incredibly important, the Kerner Commission.
Yes, 1968, President LBJ formed it to answer the question, why are the cities burning? And the answer they came back with was devastating for the police and for the country.
I have a quote here from the report. It says that for many black Americans, the police have come to symbolize white power, white racism, and white repression.
That is searing language for a government report. I mean, can you imagine that today? They basically said, you built a system of stranger policing that has completely alienated these communities. The professional model is a failure. They recognized that the patrol car and the radio had created a wall of mistrust.
But here is the thing that makes no sense to me, the ultimate paradox. The professional model was supposed to be efficient. It was supposed to control crime. But the data says it didn't.
Dryly, no, not even a little bit. This is the data paradox that broke the model. In the 1960s and 70s, we poured money into policing. We bought helicopters, faster cars, computers. We created SWAT teams. The militarization of policing really starts here. And yet, crime rates didn't just go up, they doubled.
Doubled. So the science of crime control failed on its own terms. Its primary metric for success showed total failure.
Completely. It turns out that O.W. Wilson was wrong. Decades of research, starting with the Kansas City Preventive Patrol experiment in the 70s, showed that random patrol doesn't deter crime. Crime is rarely happening in plain sight on the street corner exactly when a car drives by. And rapid response doesn't solve crimes because most crimes are reported 30 minutes or an hour after they happen. Getting there in 3 minutes versus 10 minutes makes zero difference if the burglar is already gone.
So the core tenets of the entire model were based on faulty assumptions.
They were. They were based on a mechanical view of society that just isn't true.
So the system is failing, crime is up, trust is down, the cities are burning. What was the reaction from the top? Did they say, oops, our mistake, maybe we should go back to walking the beat?
No. They doubled down. This is the tragedy of the feedback loop.
Yeah.
The establishment looked at the rising crime and the riots and said, clearly, we aren't being tough enough. We need more control. We need harsher sentences. We need a war on crime and then a war on drugs.
Which just deepens the divide. It confirms the community's worst fears.
It creates a death spiral. The community trusts the police less, so they stop reporting crime. They stop being witnesses. They stop cooperating. The research calls this avoidance.
I've heard this term. It's a survival strategy, right?
It is. If you don't trust the system, if you think calling the police will make things worse for you or your family, you stay as far away from it as possible. But here's the thing. Police need the public. They can't solve crimes without information. If the community goes silent, the police are flying blind.
So crime gets harder to solve, which makes the police more frustrated and more aggressive in their tactics, which makes the community retreat even further.
And that is the legacy of the reform era. We built a machine that was incredibly efficient at responding to calls, but terrible at solving the root causes of problems or building the trust necessary to actually prevent crime in the first place.
And we are still living with that legacy. That machine is still the default.
We are. The SWAT teams, the focus on response times, the stats-driven management like ComStat, that all comes directly from this era. It's the hardware we're still running on.
Which brings us to the final segment. Segment 5, the struggle for the community era. Or, as I'm thinking of it, trying to put the toothpaste back in the tube.
Laughs. That's a good way to put it. It's a very sticky problem. Starting in the 1980s and 90s, there was this widespread realization, at least in academic and some policing circles, that the professional model had failed. We had to pivot again.
Enter community policing.
It became the buzzword. The idea was to recapture the partnership of the 1800s, but without the corruption. Get officers out of their cars, get them walking beats again, have them build relationships.
We heard about broken windows policing. I feel like this is a term everyone knows, but maybe gets wrong. What was the original idea?
It is very misunderstood. The theory, put forth by James Q. Wilson and George Kelling, was that if a neighborhood looks disordered, broken windows, graffiti, trash, it invites more serious crime because it sends a signal that nobody cares and nobody is in control.
So the idea was to fix the windows, to work with the community to clean things up.
The idea was to engage with the community to restore order, to have foot patrols who knew the residents and could help solve small problems before they became big ones. It was supposed to be about partnership, but in practice, in many big cities, it morphed into zero tolerance.
Instead of fixing the window, they arrested the kid who broke it.
Exactly. Or they arrested someone for jaywalking or loitering or selling loose cigarettes. It became about aggressive enforcement of minor offenses. The police thought they were restoring order, but many communities felt like they were being harassed for just existing. It became another tool of control, not partnership.
So even when they tried to pivot back to community, the control mindset of the reform era took over.
Because culture eats strategy for breakfast. You can't just tell an officer who has been trained for 20 years as a crime fighter and a warrior to suddenly become a social worker and a guardian. The entire structure is against it.
The infrastructure fights back.
The infrastructure fights back. The promotion systems are still based on arrests and tickets. The 911 system still demands rapid response to every call. The cars are still there. You can have a special community policing unit, but if the other 90% of the force is still doing stranger policing, it doesn't move the needle in a meaningful way.
And that brings us to the present day. The outline lists the flashpoints we all know. Rodney King in 91, Ferguson in 2014, George Floyd in 2020.
These are the moments where the third rail arcs. They are the national expressions of the same local tensions. They reveal that despite 40 years of talking about community policing, the underlying structure, the detachment, the you first them dynamic created in the reform era is still the dominant operating system.
The source describes the current state as a landscape of declining trust. And it notes that this isn't just an image problem, it's a public safety problem.
It is. It's a fundamental crisis of legitimacy. When trust collapses, the system breaks. The source notes that clearance rates for murders, the percentage of murders that actually get solved, have been dropping for decades. Why? A huge part of it is because people don't talk to the police anymore.
So we've traced the arc. We went from the political era, too close, too corrupt. Then the pendulum swung hard to the reform era, too far, too detached. And now we are stuck in the middle trying to find a balance that might not exist.
We are trying to run community software on control hardware, and the system keeps crashing.
That brings me back to that number on the cover art for this deep dive. That faded 74%. Maybe that represents the portion of the problem that is structural versus individual. We spend so much time focusing on bad apples, but we almost completely ignore the design of the barrel.
That's the deep dive takeaway, I think. You can fire a bad officer, but you can't fire the history of the patrol car. You can't fire the 911 system. You can't fire the legacy of the slave patrols. Those are structural realities that shape how policing happens every single day, no matter who is wearing the uniform.
So let's wrap this up with a final thought for the listener. What is the provocation here? Where do we go from this?
The question for me, after going through all this, is whether we are asking the police to do something impossible. We want them to be efficient, rapid response warriors who can handle a mass shooter, but we also want them to be empathetic, slow-moving neighbors who can handle a mental health crisis or a dispute between kids playing in the street.
Can one institution be both? Can one person be both?
History suggests it's very, very difficult. The reformers of the 1930s chose efficiency and control. We are living with the consequences of their choice. If we want something different, if we want a true community safety, we might have to design something that doesn't look like a police department at all for some of these problems.
We might need to build a new rail, not just fix the old one.
We might.
That is a lot to think about. Next time you see a patrol car glide past you, don't just look at the lights. Look at the glass. Look at the barrier. And think about the 100 years of history that put that officer behind the wheel and you on the sidewalk.
It's not just a car. It's a time machine.
Thank you for taking this dive with us. Don't touch the third rail, but don't be afraid to look at it.
Stay curious.
We'll see you next time.